Notes on Innocents Abroad, dictated in Florence, Italy, April 1904. I will begin with a note upon the dedication. I wrote the book in the months of March and April 1868 in San Francisco. It was published in August of 1869. 3 years afterward, Mr. Goodman of Virginia City, Nevada, on whose newspaper I had served 10 years before, came east, and we were walking down Broadway one day when he said, "How did you come to steal Oliver Wendell Holmes's dedication and put it into your book?" I made a careless and inconsequential answer, for I supposed he was joking. But he assured me that he was in earnest. He said, "I'm not discussing the question of whether you stole it or didn't, for that is a question that can be settled in the first bookstore we come to. I am only asking you how you came to steal it, for that is where my curiosity is focalized." I couldn't accommodate him with this information, as I hadn't it in stock. I could have made oath that I had not stolen anything. Therefore my vanity was not hurt, nor my spirit troubled. At bottom, I supposed that he had mistaken another book for mine, and was now getting himself into an untenable place and preparing sorrow for himself and triumph for me. We entered a bookstore, and he asked for the Innocents Abroad, and for the dainty little blue and gold edition of Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes's poems. He opened the books, exposed their dedications, and said, "Read them. It is plain to see that the author of the second edition, the second one, stole the first one, isn't it?" I was very much ashamed and unspeakably astonished. We continued our walk, but I was not able to throw any gleam of light upon that original question of his. I could not remember ever having seen Dr. Holmes's dedication. I knew the poems, but the dedication was new to me. I did not get hold of the key to that secret until months afterward. Then it came in a curious way, and yet it was a natural way, for the natural way provided by nature and the construction of the human mind for the discovery of a forgotten event is to employ another forgotten event for its resurrection. I received a letter from the Reverend Dr. Rising, who had been rector of the Episcopal Church in Virginia City at the time, in which letter Dr. Rising made reference to certain things which had happened to us in the Sandwich Islands 6 years before. Among other things, he made casual mention of the Honolulu Hotel's poverty in the matter of literature. At first, I did not see the bearing of the remark. It called nothing to my mind, but presently it did, with a flash. There was but one book in Mr. Kirchhoff's hotel, and that was the first volume of Dr. Holmes's Blue and Gold series. I had had a fortnight's chance to get well acquainted with its contents, for I had ridden around the Big Island, Hawaii, on horseback, and had brought back so many saddle boils that if there had been a duty on them, it would have bankrupted me to pay it. They kept me in my room, unclothed and in persistent pain, for 2 weeks, with no company but cigars and the little volume of poems. Of course, I read them almost constantly. I read them from beginning to end, then read them backwards, then began in the middle and read them both ways, then reading them wrong end first and upside down. In a word, I read the book to rags, and was infinitely grateful to the hand that wrote it. Here we have an exhibition of what repetition can do, when persisted in daily and hourly over a considerable stretch of time, where one is merely reading for entertainment without thought or intention of preserving in the memory that which is read. It is a process which in the course of years dries all the juice out of a familiar verse of Scripture, leaving nothing but a sapless husk behind. In that case, you at least know the origin of the husk, but in the case in point, I apparently preserved the husk, but presently forgot whence it came. It lay lost in some dim corner of my memory a year or two, then came forward when I needed a dedication and was promptly mistaken by me as a child of my own happy fancy. I was new, I was ignorant. The mysteries of the human mind were a sealed book to me as yet, and I stupidly looked upon myself as a tough and unforgivable criminal. I wrote to Dr. Holmes and told him the whole disgraceful affair, implored him in impassioned language to believe that I had never intended to commit this crime, and was unaware that I had committed it until I was confronted with the awful evidence. I have lost his answer. I could better have afforded to lose an uncle. Of these I had a surplus, many of them of no real value to me, but that letter was beyond price, beyond uncledom and unsparable. In it, Dr. Holmes laughed the kindest and healingest laughter over the whole matter, and at considerable length and in happy phrase assured me that there was no crime in unconscious plagiarism, that I committed it every day, that he committed it every day, that every man alive on earth who writes or speaks commits it every day, and not merely once or twice, but every time he opens his mouth, that all our phrasings are spiritualized shadows, cast multitudinously from our readings, that no happy phrase of ours is ever quite original with us. There is nothing of our own in it except some slight change born of our temperament. Character, environment, teachings, and associations, that this strange, slight change differentiates it from another man's manner of saying it, stamps it with our special style, and makes it our own for the time being, all the rest of it being old, moldy, antique, and smelling of the breath of 1,000 generations of them that have passed it over their teeth before. In the 30-odd years which have come and gone since then, I have satisfied myself that what Dr. Holmes said was true. I wish to make a note upon the preface of the Innocents. In the last paragraph of that brief preface, I speak of the proprietors of the Daily Alta California having waived their rights in certain letters which I wrote for that journal while absent on the Quaker City trip. I was young then. I am white-headed now, but the insult of that word rankles yet. Now that I am reading that paragraph for the first time in many years, reading it for the first time since it was written, perhaps, there were rights, it is true, such rights as the strong are able to acquire over the weak and the absent. Early in '66, George Barnes invited me to resign my reportership on his paper, the San Francisco Morning Call, and for some months thereafter I was without money or work. Then I had a pleasant turn of fortune. The proprietors of the Sacramento Union, a great and influential daily journal, sent me to the Sandwich Islands to write 4 letters a month at $20 apiece. I was there 4 or 5 months, and returned to find myself about the best-known honest man on the Pacific coast. Thomas McGuire, proprietor of several theaters, said that now was the time to make my fortune. Strike while the iron was hot. Break into the lecture field. I did it. I announced a lecture on the Sandwich Islands, closing the advertisements with the remark, "Admission $1. Doors open at 7:30. The trouble begins at 8." A true prophecy. The trouble certainly did begin at 8, when I found myself in front of the only audience I had ever faced, for the fright which pervaded me from head to foot was paralyzing. It lasted 2 minutes and was as bitter as death. The memory of it is indestructible. But it had its compensations, for it made me immune from timidity before audiences for all time to come. I lectured in all the principal Californian towns and in Nevada, then lectured once or twice more in San Francisco, then retired from the field rich, for me, and laid out a plan to sail westward from San Francisco and go around the world. The proprietors of the Alta engaged me to write an account of the trip for that paper, 50 letters of a column and a half each, which would be about 2,000 words per letter, and the pay to be $20 per letter. I went east to St. Louis to say goodbye to my mother, and then I was bitten by the prospectus of Captain Duncan of the Quaker City excursion, and I ended by joining it. During the trip, I wrote and sent the 50 letters. 6 of them miscarried, and I wrote 6 new ones to complete my contract. Then I put together a lecture on the trip and delivered it in San Francisco at great and satisfactory pecuniary profit. Then I branched out into the country and was aghast at the result. I had been entirely forgotten. I never had people enough in my houses to sit as a jury of inquest on my lost reputation. I inquired into this curious condition of things and found that the thrifty owners of that prodigiously rich Alta newspaper had copyrighted all those poor little $20 letters, and had threatened with prosecution any journal which should venture to copy a paragraph from them. And there I was. I had contracted to furnish a large book concerning the excursion to the American Publishing Company of Hartford, and I supposed I should need all those letters to fill it out with. I was in an uncomfortable situation. That is, if the proprietors of this stealthily acquired copyright should refuse to let me use the letters. That is just what they did. Mr. Mac something, I have forgotten the rest of his name, said his firm were going to make a book out of the letters in order to get back the $1,000 which they had paid for them. I said that if they had acted fairly and honorably and had allowed the country press to use the letters or portions of them, my lecture skirmish on the coast would have paid me $10,000, whereas the Alta had lost me that amount. Then he offered a compromise. He would publish the book and allow me 10% royalty on it. The compromise did not appeal to me, and I said so. I was now quite unknown outside of San Francisco. The book's sale would be confined to that city, and my royalty would not pay me enough to board me 3 months, whereas my Eastern contract, if carried out, could be profitable to me, for I had a sort of reputation on the Atlantic seaboard acquired through the publication of 6 excursion letters in the New York Tribune, and 1 or 2 in the Herald. In the end, Mr. Mac agreed to suppress his book on certain conditions. In my preface, I must thank the Alta for waiving rights and granting me permission. I objected to the thanks. I could not, with any large degree of sincerity, thank the Alta for bankrupting my lecture raid. After considerable debate, my point was conceded and the thanks left out. Noah Brooks was the editor of the Alta at the time, a man of sterling character and equipped with a right heart, also a good historian where facts were not essential. In biographical sketches of me written many years afterwards, 1902, he was quite eloquent in praises of the generosity of the Alta people in giving to me without compensation a book which, as history had afterward shown, was worth a fortune. After all the fuss, I did not levy heavily upon the Alta letters. I found that they were newspaper matter, not book matter. They had been written here and there and yonder, as opportunity had given me a chance working moment or two during our feverish flight around Europe or in the furnace heat of my stateroom on board the Quaker City. Therefore, they were loosely constructed and needed to have some of the wind and water squeezed out of them. I used several of them, 10 or 12 perhaps. I wrote the rest of The Innocents Abroad in 60 days, and I could have added a fortnight's labor with the pen and gotten along without the letters altogether. I was very young in those days, exceedingly young, marvelously young, younger than I am now, younger than I shall ever be again by hundreds of years. I worked every night from 11 or 12 until broad day in the morning, and as I did 200,000 words in the 60 days, The average was more than 3,000 words a day. Nothing for Sir Walter Scott, nothing for Louis Stevenson, nothing for plenty of other people, but quite handsome for me. In 1897, when we were living in Tedworth Square, London, and I was writing the book called Following the Equator, my average was 1,800 words a day. Here in Florence, 1904, my average seems to be 1,400 words per sitting of 4 or 5 hours. I was deducing from the above that I have been slowing down steadily in these 36 years, but I perceive that my statistics have a defect. 3,000 words in the spring of 1868 was when I was working 7 or 8 or 9 hours a sitting, has little or no advantage over the sitting today covering half the time and producing half the output. Figures often beguile me, particularly when I have to arrange of them myself, in which case the remark attributed to Disraeli would often apply with justice and force. There are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. Dictated January 23, 1907. The proverb says that Providence protects children and idiots. This is really true. I know it because I have tested it. It did not protect George through the most of his campaign, but it served him in his last inning, and the veracity of the proverb stood confirmed. I have several times been saved by this mysterious interposition when I was manifestly in extreme peril. It has been common all my life for smart people to perceive me in an easy prey for selfish designs, and I have walked without suspicion into the trap set for me, yet often have come out unscathed against all the likelihoods. More than 40 years ago in San Francisco, the office staff adjourned upon conclusion of its work at 2 o'clock in the morning to a great bowling establishment where there were 12 alleyways. I was invited rather perfunctorily as a matter of etiquette, by which I mean that I was invited politely but not urgently. When I diffidently declined with thanks and explained that I knew nothing about the game, those lively young fellows became at once eager and anxious and urgent to have my society. This flattered me, for I perceived no trap, and I innocently and gratefully accepted their invitation. I was given an alley all to myself. The boys explained the game to me, and they also explained to me that there would be an hour's play, and that the player who scored the fewest 10 strikes in the hour would have to provide oysters and beer for the combination. This disturbed me very seriously, since it promised me bankruptcy, and I was sorry that this detail had been overlooked in the beginning. But my pride would not allow me to back out now, so I stayed in and did what I could to look satisfied and glad I had come. It is not likely that I looked as contented as I wanted to, but the others looked glad enough to make up for it, for they were quite unable to hide their evil joy. They showed me how to stand, how to stoop, how to aim the ball, and how to let fly, and then the game began. The results were astonishing. In my ignorance, I delivered the balls in apparently every way except the right one. But no matter, during half an hour I never started a ball down the alley that didn't score a 10 strike every time at the other end. The others lost their grip early, and their joy along with it. Now and then one of them got a 10 strike, but the occurrence was so rare that it made no show alongside of my giant score. The boys surrendered at the end of the half hour, and put on their coats and gathered around me and in courteous but sufficiently definite language expressed their opinion of an experienced, worn, and seasoned expert who would stoop to lying and deception in order to rob kind and well-meaning friends who had put their trust in him under the delusion that he was an honest and honorable person. I was not able to convince them that I had not lied, for now my character was gone, and they refused to attach any value to anything I said. The proprietor of the place stood by for a while, saying nothing. Then he came to my defense. He said, "It looks like a mystery, gentlemen, but it isn't a mystery after it's explained. That is a grooved alley. You've only to start the ball down it any way you please, and the groove will do the rest. It will slam the ball against the northeast curve of the head pin every time, and nothing can save the 10 from going down." It was true. The boys made the experiment, and they found that there was no art that could send the ball down that alley and fail to score a 10 strike with it. When I had told those boys that I knew nothing about that game, I was speaking only the truth, but it was ever thus all through my life. Whenever I have diverged from custom and principle and uttered a truth, the rule has been that the hearer hadn't strength of mind enough to believe it. A quarter of a century ago, I arrived in London to lecture a few weeks under the management of George Dolby, who had conducted the Dickens readings in America 5 or 6 years before. He took me to the Albemarle and fed me, and in the course of the dinner he enlarged a good deal, and with great satisfaction, upon his reputation as a player of 15-ball pool. And when he learned by my testimony that I had never seen the game played, and knew nothing of the art of pocketing balls, he enlarged more and more, and still more, and kept on enlarging until I recognized that I was either in the presence of the very father of 15-ball pool, or in the presence of his most immediate descendant. At the end of the dinner, Dolby was eager to introduce me to the game and show me what he could do. We adjourned to the billiard room, and he framed the balls in a flat pyramid and told me to fire at the apex ball and then go on and do what I could toward pocketing the 15, after which he would take the cue and show me what a past master of the game could do with those balls. I did as required. I began with the diffidence proper to my ignorant estate, and when I had finished my inning, all the balls were in the pockets, and Dolby was burying me under a volcanic eruption of acid sarcasms. So I was a liar in Dolby's belief. He thought he had been sold, and at a cheap rate, but he divided his sarcasms quite fairly and quite equally between the two of us. He was full of ironical admiration of his childishness and innocence in letting a wandering and characterless and scandalous American load him up with deceptions of so transparent a character that they ought not to have deceived the house cat. On the other hand, he was remorselessly severe upon me for beguiling him by studied and creditable artifice into bragging and boasting about his poor game in the presence of a professional expert disguised in lies and frauds, who could empty more balls in billiard pockets in an hour than he could empty into a basket in a day. In the matter of 15-ball pool, I never got Dolby's confidence wholly back, though I got it in other ways and kept it until his death. I have played that game a number of times since, but that first time was the only time in my life that I have ever pocketed all the 15 in a single inning. My unsuspicious nature has made it necessary for Providence to save me from traps a number of times. 30 years ago, a couple of Elmira bankers invited me to play the game of Quaker with them. I had never heard of the game before, and said that if it required intellect, I should not be able to entertain them, but they said it was merely a game of chance and required no mentality. So I agreed to make a trial of it. They appointed 4 in the afternoon for the sacrifice. As the place, they chose a ground floor room with a large window in it, but they went treacherously around and advertised the cell which they were going to play upon me. I arrived on time, and we began the game, with a large and eager free list to superintendent. These superintendents were outside, with their noses pressed against the window pane. The bankers described the game to me. So far as I recollect, the pattern of it was this. They had a pile of Mexican dollars on the table. 12 of them were of even date, 50 of them were of odd dates. The bankers were to separate a coin from the pile and hide it under a hand, and I must guess odd or even. If I guessed correctly, the coin would be mine, if incorrectly, I lost $1. The first guess I made was even, and was right. I guessed again, even, and took the money. They fed me another one, and I guessed even again, and took the money. I guessed even the fourth time, and took the money. It seemed to me that even was a good guess, and I might as well stay by it, which I did. I guessed even 12 times, and took the $12. I was doing as they secretly desired. Their experience of human nature had convinced them that any human being as innocent as my face proclaimed me to be would repeat his first guess if it won, and would go on repeating it if it should continue to win. It was their belief that an innocent would be almost sure at the beginning to guess even and not odd, and that if an innocent should guess even 12 times in succession and win every time, he would go on guessing even to the end. So it was their purpose to let me win those 12 even dates, and then advance the odd dates one by one until I should lose $50, and furnish those superintendents something to laugh about for a week to come. But it did not come out in that way, for by the time I had won the 12th dollar and the last even date, I withdrew from the game because it was so one-sided that it was monotonous and did not entertain me. There was a burst of laughter from the superintendents at the window when I came out of the place, but I did not know that they were what they were laughing at, nor whom they were laughing at, and it was a matter of no interest to me anyway. Through that incident, I acquired an enviable reputation for smartness and penetration, but it was not my due, for I had not penetrated anything that the cow could not have penetrated. From Susie's Biography of Me, February 12th, 86. Mama and I have both been very much troubled of late because Papa, since he has been publishing General Grant's book, has seemed to forget his own books and work entirely. And the other evening, as Papa and I were promenading up and down the library, he told me that he didn't expect to write but one more book, and then he was ready to give up the work altogether, die, or do anything. He said that he had written more than he had ever expected to, and the only book that he had been particularly anxious to write was one locked up in the safe downstairs, not yet published. But this intended future, of course, will never do, and although Papa usually holds to his own opinions and intents with outsiders, when Mama really desires anything and says that it must be Papa, Papa always gives up his plans, at least so far, and does as she says is right. And she is usually right, if she disagrees with him at all. It was because he knew his great tendency to being convinced by her that he published, without her knowledge, that article in the Christian Union concerning the government of children. So judging by the proofs of past years, I think that we will be able to persuade Papa to go back to work as before, and not leave off writing with the end of his next story. Mama says that she sometimes feels, and I do too, that she would rather have Papa depend on his writing for a living than to have him think of giving it up. Dictated November 8th, 1906. I have a defect of a sort which I think is not common. Certainly I hope it isn't. It is rare that I can call before my mind's eye the form and face of either friend or enemy. If I should make a list now of persons whom I know in America and abroad, say to the number of an even and entire 1,000, it is quite unlikely that I could reproduce 5 of them in my mind's eye. Of my dearest and most intimate friends, I could name 8 who I have seen and talked with 4 days ago, but when I try to call them before me, they are formless shadows. Jean has been absent this past 8 or 10 days in the country, and I wish I could reproduce her in the mirrors of my mind, but I can't do it. It may be that this defect is not constitutional, but a result of lifelong absence of mind and indolent and inadequate observation. Once or twice in my life it has been an embarrassment to me. 20 years ago, in the days of Susie's Biography of Me, there was a dispute one morning at the breakfast table about the color of a neighbor's eyes. I was asked for a verdict, but had to confess that if that valued neighbor and old friend had eyes, I was not sure that I had ever seen them. It was then mockingly suggested that perhaps I didn't even know the colors of the eyes of my own family, and I was required to shut my own at once and testify. I was able to name the color of Mrs. Clemens's eyes, but was not able to even suggest a color for Jean's or Clara's or Susie's. All this talk is suggested by Susie's remark, "The other evening, as Papa and I were promenading up and down the library." Down to the bottom of my heart, I am thankful that I can see that picture, and it is not dim but stands out clear in the unfaded light of 21 years ago. In those days, Susie and I used to promenade daily up and down the library with our arms about each other's waists and deal in intimate communion concerning affairs of state or the deep questions of human life or our small personal affairs. It was quite natural that I should think I had written myself out when I was only 50 years old, for everybody who has ever written has been smitten with that superstition at about that age. Not even yet have I really written myself out. I have merely stopped writing because dictating is pleasanter work, and because dictating has given me a strong aversion to the pen, and because 2 hours of talking per day is enough, and because... But I am only damaging my mind with this digging around in it for pretexts where no pretext is needed, and where the simple truth is for this one time better than any invention. In this small emergency, I shall never finish my 5 or 6 unfinished books, for the reason that by 40 years of slavery to the pen I have earned my freedom. I detest the pen, and I wouldn't use it again to sign the death warrant of my nearest enemy. Dictated March 8th, 1906. For 30 years, I have received an average of a dozen letters a year from strangers who remember me, or whose fathers remember me as a boy and young man. But these letters are almost always disappointing. I have not known these strangers, nor their fathers. I have not heard of the names they mention. The reminiscences to which they call attention have had no part in my experience. All of which means that these strangers have been mistaking me for someone else. But at last I have the refreshment this morning of a letter from a man who deals in names that were familiar to me in my boyhood. The writer encloses a newspaper clipping which has been wandering through the press for 4 or 5 weeks, and he wants to know if Captain Tanqueray, lately deceased, was, as stated in the clipping, the original of Huckleberry Finn. I have replied that Huckleberry Finn was Frank F. As this inquirer evidently knew the Hannibal of the 40s, he will easily recall Frank. Frank's father was at one time the town drunkard, an exceedingly well-defined and unofficial office of those days. He succeeded General Gaines for a time. For a time he was sole and only incumbent of the office. But afterward, Jimmy Finn proved competency and disputed the place with him, so he had 2 town drunkards at one time, and it made as much trouble in that village as Christendom experienced in the 14th century when there were 2 popes at the same time. In Huckleberry Finn, I have drawn Frank exactly as he was. He was ignorant, unwashed, insufficiently fed, but he had as good a heart as any boy had. His liberties were totally unrestricted. He was the only really independent person, boy or man, in the community, and by consequence he was tranquilly and continuously happy, and was envied by all the rest of us. We liked him. We enjoyed his society, and as his society was forbidden us by our parents, the prohibition trebled and quadrupled its value, and therefore we sought and got more of his society than of any other boys. I heard 4 years ago that he was justice of the peace in a remote village in the state of, and was a good citizen and was greatly respected. During Jimmy Finn's turn, Jimmy, was not exclusive. He was not finical. He was not hypocritical. He was largely and handsomely democratic, and slept in the deserted tan yard with the hogs. My father tried to reform him once, but did not succeed. My father was not a professional reformer. In him, the spirit of reform was spasmodic. It only broke out now and then, with considerable intervals in between. Once he tried to reform Injun Joe. That also was a failure. It was a failure, and we boys were glad, for Injun Joe, drunk, was interesting and a benefaction to us, but Injun Joe, sober, was a dreary spectacle. We watched my father's experiments upon him with a good deal of anxiety, but it came out all right, and we were satisfied. Injun Joe got drunk oftener than before, and became intolerably interesting. I think that in Tom Sawyer, I starved Injun Joe to death in the cave, but that may have been to meet the exigencies of romantic literature. I can't remember now whether the real Injun Joe died in the cave or out of it, but I do remember that the news of his death reached me at a most unhappy time. That is to say, just at bedtime on a summer night, when a prodigious storm of thunder and lightning, accompanied by a deluging rain that turned the streets and lanes into rivers, caused me to repent and resolve to lead a better life. I can remember those awful thunder bursts and the white glare of the lightning yet, and the wild lashing of the rain against the window panes. By my teachings, I perfectly well knew what all that wild riot was for. Satan had come to get Injun Joe. I had no shadow of doubt about it. It was the proper thing when a person like Injun Joe was required in the underworld, and I should have thought it strange and unaccountable if Satan had come for him in a less impressive way. With every glare of lightning, I shriveled and shrunk together in mortal terror, and in the interval of black darkness that followed, I poured out my lamentings over my lost condition, and my supplications for just one more chance, with an energy and feeling and sincerity quite foreign to my nature. But in the morning I saw that it was a false alarm, and concluded to resume business at the old stand and wait for another reminder. But in the morning, the axiom says, history repeats itself. A week or two ago, Mr. Blank Blank dined with us. At dinner, he mentioned a circumstance which flashed me back over about 60 years and landed me in that little bedroom on that tempestuous night, and brought to my mind how creditable to me was my conduct through the whole night, and how barren it was of moral spot or fleck during that entire period. He said Mr. X was sexton or something of the Episcopal church in his town, and had been for many years the competent superintendent of all the church's worldly affairs, and was regarded by the whole congregation as a stay, a blessing, a priceless treasure. But he had a couple of defects, not large defects, but they seemed large when flung against the background of his profoundly religious character. He drank a good deal, and he could outswear a brakeman. A movement arose to persuade him to lay aside these vices, and after consulting with his pal, who occupied the same position as himself in the other Episcopal church, and whose defects were duplicates of his own and had inspired regret in the congregation he was serving, they concluded to try for reform, not wholesale, but half at a time. They took the liquor pledge and waited for results. During 9 days, the results were entirely satisfactory, and they were recipients of many compliments and much congratulation. Then, on New Year's Eve, they had business a mile and a half out of town, just beyond the state line. Everything went well with them that evening in the bar room at the inn, but at the last celebration of the occasion by those villagers came to be of a burdensome nature. It was a bitter, cold night, and the multitudinous hot toddies that were circulating began by and by to exert a powerful influence on the new prohibitionists. At last, X's friend remarked, "X, does it occur to you that we are outside the diocese?" That ended Reform number 1. Then they took a chance in Reform number 2. For a while, that one prospered, and they got much applause. I now reached the incident which sent me back a matter of 60 years, as I have remarked a while ago. One morning, Mr. Blank Blank met X on the street and said, "You have made a gallant struggle against those defects of yours. I am aware that you failed on number 1, but I am also aware that you are having better luck with number 2. "Yes," X said, "number 2 is all right and sound up to date, and we are full of hope." Blank Blank said, "X, of course you have your troubles like other people, but they never show on the outside. I have never seen you when you were not cheerful. Are you always cheerful? Really always cheerful?" "Well, no," he said. "No, I can't say that I am always cheerful. But, well, you know, that kind of a night that comes, say, when you wake up way in the night and the whole world is sunk in gloom and there are storms and earthquakes and all sorts of disasters in the air, threatening, and you could get cold and clammy, and when that happens to me, I recognize how sinful I am, and it all goes clear to my heart and rings it, and I have such terrors and terrors. Oh, they are indescribable, those terrors that assail me, and I slip out of bed, and I get on my knees and pray and promise that I will be good. And if I could only have another chance, and then, you know, in the morning, the sun shines out so lovely, and the birds sing, and the whole world is so beautiful, and begod, I rally." Now, I will quote a brief paragraph from this letter which I have a minute ago spoken of. The writer says, "You no doubt are at a loss to know who I am. I will tell you. In my younger days, I was a resident of Hannibal, Missouri, and you and I were schoolmates attending Mr. Dawson's school, along with Sam and Will Bowen, and Andy Fuca, and others whose names I have forgotten. I was then about the smallest boy in school, and for my age, and they called me Little Alec for short. I only dimly remember him, but I knew those other people as well as I knew the town drunkards. I remember Dawson's schoolhouse perfectly. If I wanted to describe it, I could save myself the trouble by conveying the description of it to these pages from Tom Sawyer. I can remember the drowsy and inviting summer sounds that used to float in through the open windows from that distant boy paradise, Cardiff Hill, Hollidays Hill, and mingle with the murmurs of the studying pupils, and make them the more dreary by the contrast. I remember Andy Fuca, the oldest pupil, a man of 25. I remember the youngest pupil, Nanny Owsley, a child of 7. I remember George Robards, 18 or 20 years old, the only pupil who studied Latin. I remember in some cases vividly, in others vaguely, the rest of the 25 boys and girls. I remember Mr. Dawson very well. I remember his boy, Theodore, who was as good as he could be. In fact, he was inordinately good, extravagantly good, offensively good, detestably good. And he had pop eyes, and I would have drowned him if I had had a chance. In that school, we were all about on an equality, and so far as I remember, the passion of envy had no place in our hearts, except in the case of Arch Fuca, the older one's brother. Of course, we all went barefoot in the summertime. Arch Fuca was about my own age, 10 or 11. In the winter, we could stand him, because he wore shoes then, and his great gift was hidden from our sight, and we were able to forget it. But in the summertime, he was a bitterness to us. He was our envy, for he could double back his big toe and let it fly, and you could hear it snap 30 yards. There was not another boy in the school that could approach this feat. He had not a rival as regards a physical distinction, except in Theodore Eddy, who could work his ears like a horse. But he was no real rival, because you couldn't hear him work his ears, so all the advantage lay with Arch Fuca. I am not done with Dawson's School. I will return to it in a later chapter. Dictated to Hamilton, Bermuda, January 6, 1907. That reminds me. In conversation, we are always using that phrase, and seldom or never noticing how large a significance it bears. It stands for a curious and interesting fact, to wit, that sleeping or waking, dreaming or talking, the thoughts which swarm through our heads are almost constantly, almost continuously, accompanied by a like swarm of reminders or incidents and episodes of our past. A man can never know what a large traffic this commerce of association carries on in our minds until he sets out to write his autobiography. Then he finds that a thought is seldom born to him that does not immediately remind him of some event, large or small, in his past experience. Quite naturally, these remarks remind me of various things, among others this, that sometimes a thought, by the power of association, will bring back to your mind a lost word or a lost name which you have not been able to recover by any other process known to your mental equipment. Yesterday, we had an instance of this. Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell is with me on this flying trip to Bermuda. He was with me on my last visit to Bermuda, and today we were trying to remember when it was. We thought it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 years ago, but that was as near as we could get at the date. Twitchell said that the landlady in whose boarding house we sojourned in that ancient time could doubtless furnish us the date, and we must look her up. We wanted to see her anyway, because she and her blooming daughter of 18 were the only persons whose acquaintance we had made at that time, for we were traveling under fictitious names, and people who wear aliases are not given to seeking the society and bringing themselves under suspicion. But at this point in our talk, we encountered an obstruction. We could not recall the landlady's name. We hunted around all through our minds for that name, using all the customary methods of research, but without success. The name was gone from us, apparently, permanently. We finally gave the matter up and fell to talking about something else. The talk wandered from one subject to another, and finally arrived at Twitchell's boys' school days in Hartford, the Hartford of something more than half a century ago, and he mentioned several of his schoolmasters, dwelling with special interest upon the peculiarities of an aged one named Olney. He remarked that Olney, humble village schoolmaster as he was yet a man of superior parts, and had published textbooks which had enjoyed a wide currency in America in their day. I said I remembered those books, and had studied Olney's geography in school when I was a boy. Then Twitchell said, "That reminds me, our landlady's name was a name that was associated with school books of some kind or other 50 or 60 years ago. I wonder what it was. I believe it began with K." Association did the rest, and did it instantly. I said, "Kirkham's Grammar." That settled it. Kirkham was the name, and we went out to seek for the owner of it. There was no trouble about that, for Bermuda is not large, and is like the earlier Garden of Eden, in that everybody in it knows everybody else, just as it was in the Serpent's headquarters in Adam's time. We easily found Miss Kirkham, she that had been the blooming girl of a generation before, and she was still keeping boarders, but her mother had passed from this life. She settled the date for us, and did it with certainty, by help of a couple of uncommon circumstances, events of that ancient time. She said we had sailed from Bermuda on the 24th of May, 1877, which was the day on which her only nephew was born, and he is now 30 years of age. The other unusual circumstance, she called it an unusual circumstance, and I didn't say anything, was that on that day, the Reverend Mr. Twitchell, bearing the assumed name of Peters, had made a statement to her which she regarded as a fiction. I remembered the circumstance very well. We had bidden the young girl goodbye and had gone 50 yards, perhaps, when Twitchell said he had forgotten something. I doubted it, and must go back. When he rejoined me, he was silent, and this alarmed me, because I had not seen an example of it before. He seemed quite uncomfortable, and I asked him what the trouble was. He said he had been inspired to give the girl a pleasant surprise, and so had gone back and said to her, "That young fellow's name is not Wilkinson, that's Mark Twain." She did not lose her mind. She did not exhibit any excitement at all, but said, quite simply, quite tranquilly, "Tell it to the Marines, Mr. Peters, if that should happen to be your name." It was very pleasant to meet her again. We were white-headed, and she was not. In the sweet and unvexed spiritual atmosphere of the Bermudas, one does not achieve gray hairs at 48. I had a dream last night, and of course it was born of association, like nearly everything else that drifts into a person's head, asleep or awake. On board ship, on the passage down, Twitchell was talking about the swiftly developing possibilities of aerial navigation, and he quoted those striking verses of Tennyson's which forecast a future when airborne vessels of war shall meet and fight above the clouds and redden the earth below with a rain of blood. This picture of carnage and blood and death reminded me of something which I had read a fortnight ago. Statistics of railway accidents compiled by the United States government, wherein the appalling fact was set forth that on our 200,000 miles of railway we annually kill 10,000 persons outright and injure 80,000. The warships in the air suggested the railway horrors, and 3 nights afterward the railway horrors suggested my dream. The work of association was going on in my head unconsciously all the time. It was an admirable dream, what there was of it. In it, I saw a funeral procession. I saw it from a mountain peak. I saw it crawling along and curving here and there, serpent-like through a level, vast plain. I seemed to see 100 miles of the procession, but neither the beginning nor the end of it was within the limits of my vision. The procession was in 10 divisions, each division marked by a somber flag, and the whole represented 10 years of our railway activities in the accident line. Each division was composed of 80,000 cripples, and was bearing its own year's 10,000 mutilated corpses to the grave. In the aggregate, 800,000 cripples and 100,000 dead, drenched in blood. Dictated October 10, 1906. Susie has named a number of the friends who were assembled at Onteora at the time of our visit, but there were others. Among them, Lawrence Hutton, Charles Dudley Warner, and Carol Beckwith and their wives. It was a bright and jolly company. Some of those choice spirits are with us still. The others have passed from this life. Mrs. Clemens, Susie, Mr. Warner, Mary Mapes Dodge, Lawrence Hutton, Dean Sage. Peace to their ashes. Susie is in error in thinking Mrs. Dodge was not there at the time. We were her guests. We arrived at nightfall, dreary from a tiresome journey, but the dreariness did not last. Mrs. Dodge had provided a homemade banquet, and the happy company sat down to it, 20 strong or more. Then the thing happened, which always happens at large dinners, and is always exasperating. Everybody talked to his elbow mates, and all talked at once, and gradually raised their voices higher and higher and higher, in the desperate effort to be heard. It was like a riot, an insurrection. It was an intolerable volume of noise. Presently I said to the lady next to me, "I will subdue this riot. I will silence this racket. There is only one way to do it, but I know the art. You must tilt your head toward mine, and seem to be deeply interested in what I am saying. I will talk in a low voice then, just because our neighbors won't be able to hear me. They will want to hear me. If I mumble long enough, say 2 minutes, you will see that the dialogues will, one after another, come to a standstill, and there will be silence, not a sound anywhere but my mumbling. Then, in a very low voice, I began. When I went out to Chicago 11 years ago to witness the Grant festivities, there was a great banquet on the first night, with 600 ex-soldiers present. The gentleman who sat next to me was Mr. X. X was very hard of hearing, and he had a habit common to deaf people of shouting his remarks instead of delivering them in an ordinary voice. He would handle his knife and fork in reflective silence for 5 or 6 minutes at a time, and then suddenly fetch out a shout that would make you jump out of the United States. By this time, the insurrection at Mrs. Dodge's table, at least that part of it in my immediate neighborhood, had died down, and the silence was spreading. Couple by couple down the long table, I went on in a lower and still lower mumble, and most impressively. During one of Mr. X's mute intervals, a man opposite us approached the end of a story which he had been telling his elbow neighbor. He was speaking in a low voice. There was much noise. I was deeply interested in straining my ears to catch his words, stretching my neck, holding my breath to hear, unconscious of everything but the fascinating tale. I heard him say, at this point, he seized her by her long hair. She, shrieking and begging, bent her neck across his knee, and with one awful sweep of the razor, "How do you like Chicago?" That was X's interruption. X's interruption here at 30 miles. By the time I had reached that place in my mumblings, Mrs. Dodge's dining room was so silent, so breathlessly still, that if you had dropped a thought anywhere in it, you could have heard it smack the floor. When I delivered that yell, the entire dinner company jumped as one person and punched their heads through the ceiling, damaging it, for it was only lath and plaster, and it all came down on us, and much of it went into the victuals and made them gritty. But no one was hurt. Then I explained why it was that I had played that game, and begged them to take the moral of it home to their hearts, and be rational and merciful thenceforth, and cease from screaming en masse, and agree to let one person talk at a time, and the rest listen in graceful and unvexed peace. They granted my prayer, and we had a happy time all the rest of the evening. I do not think I have ever had a better time in my life. This was largely because the new terms enabled me to keep the floor, now that I had it, and do all the talking myself. I do like to hear myself talk. Susie has exposed that in her biography of me. Dean Sage was a delightful man, yet in one way a terror to his friends, for he loved them so well that he could not refrain from playing practical jokes on them. We have to be pretty deeply in love with a person before he can do the honor of joking familiarly with him. Dean Sage was the best citizen I have known in America. It takes courage to be a good citizen, and he had plenty of it. He allowed no individual and no corporation to infringe his smallest right and escape unpunished. He was very rich and very generous and benevolent, and he gave away his money with a prodigal hand, but if an individual or corporation infringed a right of his to the value of 10 cents, he would spend thousands of dollars worth of time and labor and money and persistence on the matter, and would not lower his flag until he had won his battle or lost it. He and Reverend Mr. Harris had been classmates in college, and to the day of Sage's death they were as fond of each other as an engaged pair. It follows, without saying, that whenever Sage found an opportunity to play a joke upon Harris, Harris was sure to suffer. Along about 1873, Sage fell a victim to an illness which reduced him to a skeleton and defied all the efforts of the physicians to cure it. He went to the Adirondacks and took Harris with him. Sage had always been an active man, and he couldn't idle any day wholly away in a nation, but walked every day to the limit of his strength. One day, toward nightfall, the pair came upon a humble log cabin which bore these words painted upon the shingle: "Entertainment for man and beast." They were obliged to stop there for the night, Sage's strength being exhausted. They entered the cabin and found its owner and sole occupant there, a rugged and sturdy and simple-hearted man of middle age. He cooked supper and placed it before the travelers: salt junk, boiled beans, cornbread, and black coffee. Sage's stomach could abide nothing but the most delicate food. Therefore this banquet revolted him, and he sat at the table unemployed, while Harris fed ravenously, limitlessly, gratefully, for he had been chaplain in a fighting regiment all through the war, and had kept in perfection the grand and uncritical appetite and splendid physical vigor which those 4 years of tough fare and activity had furnished him. Sage went supperless to bed and tossed and writhed all night upon a shuck mattress that was full of attentive and interested corncobs. In the morning, Harris was ravenous again, and devoured the odious breakfast as contentedly and delightedly as he had devoured its twin the night before. Sage sat upon the porch, empty, and contemplated the performance and meditated revenge. Presently, he beckoned to the landlord and took him aside and had a confidential talk with him. He said, "I am the paymaster. What is the bill?" 2 suppers, 50 cents. 2 beds, 30 cents. 2 breakfasts, 50 cents. Total, $1.30. Sage said, "Go back and make out the bill and fetch it to me here on the porch. Make it $13. $13? Why, it's impossible. I am no robber. I am charging you what I charge everybody. It's $1.30, and that's all it is." "My man, I've got something to say about this as well as you. It's $13. You'll make out your bill for that, and you'll take it, too, or you'll not get a cent." The man was troubled and said, "I don't understand this. I can't make it out." "Well, I understand it. I know what I am about. It's $13, and I want the bill made out for that. There's no other terms. Get it ready and bring it out here. I will examine it and be outraged. You understand? I will dispute the bill. You must stand to it. You must refuse to take less. I will begin to lose my temper. You must begin to lose yours. I will call you hard names. You must answer with harder ones. I will raise my voice. You must raise yours. You must go into a rage. Foam at the mouth if you can. Insert some soap to help it along. Now go along and follow your instructions." The man played his assigned part, and played it well. He brought the bill and stood waiting for results. Sage's face began to cloud up, his eyes to snap, and his nostrils to inflate like a horse's. Then he broke out with, $13? You mean to say that you charge $13 for these damned inhumane hospitalities of yours? Are you a professional buccaneer? Is it your custom to—" The man burst in with surprise. Now I don't want any more out of you. That's plenty. The bill is $13 and you'll pay it. That's all. A couple of characterless adventurers bilking their way through this country and attempting to dictate the terms to a gentleman who received you supposing you were gentlemen yourselves, whereas in my opinion hell's full of— Sage broke in. "Not another word of that. I won't have it. I regard you as the lowest down thief that ever—" "Don't you use that word again. By God, I'll take you by the neck and—" Harris came rushing out, and just as the two were about to grapple, he pushed himself between them and began to implore. "Oh, Dean, don't. Now, Mr. Smith, control yourself. Oh, think of your family. Dean, think what a scandal." But they burst out with maledictions, imprecations, and all the hard names they could dig out of the rich accumulations of their educated memories. And in the midst of it, the man shouted, "When gentlemen come to this house, I treat them as gentlemen. When people come to this house with the ordinary appetites of gentlemen, I charge them $1.30 for what I furnished you. But when a man brings a hell-fired famine here that gorges a barrel of pork and 4 barrels of beans at 2 sittings," Sage broke in a voice that was eloquent with remorse and self-reproach, "I never thought of that, and I ask your pardon. I am ashamed of myself and of my friend. Here's your $13 and my apologies along with it." Dictated March 12th, 1906. I have always taken a great interest in other people's duels. One always feels an abiding interest in any heroic thing which has entered into his own experience. In 1878, 14 years after my unmaterialized duel, Messieurs Fortu and Gambetta fought a duel which made heroes of both of them in France, but made them rather ridiculous throughout the rest of the world. I was living in Munich that fall and winter, and I was so interested in that funny tragedy that I wrote a long account of it. And it is in one of my books somewhere, an account which had some inaccuracies in it, but as an exposition of the spirit of the duel, I think it was correct and trustworthy. And when I was living in Vienna, 34 years after my ineffectual duel, my interest in that kind of incident was still strong, and I find here among my autobiographical manuscripts of that day a chapter which I began concerning it, but did not finish. I wanted to finish it, but held it open in the hope that the Italian ambassador, Mr. Nigra, would find time to furnish me the full history of Signor Cavalotti's adventures in that line. But he was a busy man. There was always an interruption before he could get well started, so my hope was never fulfilled. The following is the unfinished chapter. As concerns dueling, this pastime is as common in Austria today as it is in France, but with this difference, that here in the Austrian states the duel is dangerous, while in France it is not. Here it is a tragedy. In France it is a comedy. Here it is a solemnity. There it is monkey shines. Here the duelist risks his life. There he does not even risk his shirt. Here he fights with pistol or saber. In France with a hairpin, a blunt one. Here the desperately wounded man tries to walk to the hospital. There they paint the scratch so that they can find it again, lay the sufferer on a stretcher, and conduct him off the field with a band of music. At the end of a French duel, the pair hug and kiss and cry, and praise each other's valor. Then the surgeons make an examination and pick out the scratched one, and the other one helps him onto the litter and pays his fare. And in return, the scratched one treats to champagne and oysters in the evening, and then the incident is closed, as the French say. It is all polite and gracious and petty and impressive. At the end of an Austrian duel, the antagonist that is alive gravely offers his hand to the other man, utters some phrases of courteous regret, then bids him goodbye and goes his way, and that incident is also closed. The French duelist is painstakingly protected from danger by the rules of the game. His antagonist's weapon cannot reach so far as his body. If he get a scratch, it will not be above his elbow. But in Austria, the rules of the game do not provide against danger. They carefully provide for it. Usually. Commonly, the combat must be kept up until one of the men is disabled. A non-disabling slash or stab does not retire him. For a matter of 3 months, I watched the Viennese journals, and whenever a duel was reported in their telegraphic columns, I scrapbooked it. By this record, I find that dueling in Austria is not confined to journalists and old maids, as in France, but is indulged in by military men, journalists, students, physicians, lawyers, members of the legislature, and even the cabinet, the bench, and the police. Dueling is forbidden by law, and so it seems odd to see the makers and administrators of the laws dancing on their work in this way. Some months ago, Count Bodeni, at the time chief of the government, fought a pistol duel here in the capital city of the empire with Representative Wolfe, and both of those distinguished Christians came near getting turned out of the church, for the church, as well as the state, forbids dueling. In one case, lately in Hungary, the police interfered and stopped a duel after the first innings. This was a saber duel between the chief of police and the city attorney. Unkind things were said about it in the newspapers. They said the police remembered their duty uncommonly well when their own officials were the parties concerned in duels, but I think the underlings showed a good bread and butter judgment. If their superiors had carved each other up well, the public would have asked where were the police, and their places would have been endangered, but custom does not require them to be around where the mere unofficial citizens are explaining a thing with sabers. There was another duel, a double duel, going on in the immediate neighborhood at the time, and in this case the police obeyed custom and did not disturb it. Their bread and butter was not at stake there. In this duel, a physician fought a couple of surgeons and wounded both, one of them lightly, the other seriously. An undertaker wanted to keep people interfering, but that was quite natural again. Selecting at random from my record, I next find a duel at Tarnopol between military men. An officer of the 10th Dragoons charged an officer of the 9th Dragoons with an offense against the laws of the card table. There was a defect or a doubt somewhere in the matter, and this had to be examined and passed upon by the Court of Honor. So the case was sent up to Lemberg for this purpose. One would like to know what the defect was, but the newspaper does not say. A man here, who has fought many duels and has a graveyard, says that probably the matter in question was as to whether the accusation was true or not. That if the charge was a very grave one, cheating, for instance, proof of its truth would rule the guilty officer out of the field of honor. The court would not allow a gentleman to fight with such a person. You see what a solemn thing it is? You see how particular they are? Any little careless act can lose you your privilege of getting yourself shot here. The court seems to have gone into the matter in a searching and careful fashion. For several months elapsed before it reached a decision. It then sanctioned a duel, and the accused killed his accuser. Next, I find a duel between a prince and a major, first with pistols, no result satisfactory to either party, then with sabers, the major badly hurt. Next, a saber duel between journalists, the one a strong man, the other feeble and in poor health. It was brief, but the strong one drove his sword through the weak one, and death was immediate. Next, a duel between a lieutenant and a student of medicine. According to the newspaper report, these are the details. The student was in a restaurant one evening, passing along. He halted at a table to speak with some friends. Nearby sat a dozen military men. The student conceived that one of these was staring at him. He asked the officer to step outside and explain. This officer and another one gathered up their caps and sabers and went out with the student. Outside, this is the student's account. The student introduced himself to the offending officer and said, "You seemed to stare at me." For answer, the officer struck the student with his fist. The student parried the blow. Both officers drew their sabers and attacked the young fellow, and one of them gave him a wound on the left arm. Then they withdrew. This was Saturday night. The duel followed on Monday in the military riding school, the customary dueling ground all over Austria, apparently. The weapons were pistols. The dueling terms were somewhat beyond custom in the matter of severity, if I may gather that from the statement of the combat that was fought. Distance 15 steps, with 3 steps advance. There was but one exchange of shots. The student was hit. He put his hand on his breast. His body began to bend slowly forward. then collapsed in death and sank to the ground. It is pathetic. There are other duels in my list, but I find in each and all of them one and the same ever-recurring defect. The principals are never present, but only their sham representatives. The real principals in any duel are not the duelists themselves, but their families. They do the mourning, the suffering. Theirs is the loss, and theirs the misery. They stake all that. The duelist stakes nothing but his life, and that is a trivial thing compared with what his death must cost those whom he leaves behind him. Challenges should not mention the duelist. He has nothing much at stake, and the real vengeance cannot reach him. The challenge should summon the offender's old gray mother and his young wife and little children. These, or any to whom he is a dear and worshipped possession, and should say, "You have done me no harm, but I am the meek slave of a custom which requires me to crush the happiness out of your hearts and condemn you to years of pain and grief, in order that I may wash clean with your tears a stain which has been put upon me by another person." The logic of it is admirable. A person has robbed me of a penny. I must beggar 10 innocent persons to make good my loss. Surely nobody's honor is worth all that. Since the duelist's family are the real principals in a duel, the state ought to compel them to be present at it. Custom, also, ought to be amended so as to require it, and without it no duel ought to be allowed to go on. If that student's unoffending mother had been present and watching the officer through her tears as he raised his pistol, he would have fired in the air. We know that, for we know how we are all made. Laws ought to be based upon the ascertained facts of our nature. It would be a simple thing to make a dueling law which would stop dueling. As things are now, the mother is never invited. She submits to this, and without outward complaint, for she, too, is the vassal of custom, and custom requires her to conceal her pain when she learns the disastrous news that her son must go to the dueling field, and by the powerful force that is lodged in habit and custom, she is enabled to obey this trying requirement, a requirement which exacts a miracle of her, and gets it. Last January, a neighbor of ours, who has a young son in the army, was wakened by this youth at 3 o'clock one morning, and she sat up in bed and listened to his message. "I have come to tell you something, mother, which will distress you, but you must be good and brave and bear it. I have been affronted by a fellow officer, and we fight at 3 this afternoon. Lie down and sleep now, and think no more about it." She kissed him good night and lay down paralyzed with grief and fear, but said nothing. She did not sleep. She prayed and mourned till the first streak of dawn, then fled to the nearest church and implored the Virgin for help. And from that church she went to another, and another, and another, church after church, and still church after church, and so spent all the day until 3 o'clock on her knees in agony and tears, then dragged herself home and sat down comfortless and desolate to count the minutes and wait with an outward show of calm for what had been ordained for her happiness or endless misery. Presently she heard the clank of a saber. She had not known before what music was in that sound, and her son put his head in and said, "X was in the wrong, and he apologized." So that incident was closed, and for the rest of her life the mother will always find something pleasant about the clank of a saber. No doubt. In one of my listed duels, however, let it go, there is nothing particularly striking about it, except that the seconds interfered, and prematurely too, for neither man was dead. This was certainly irregular. Neither of the men liked it. It was a duel with cavalry sabers between an editor and a lieutenant. The editor walked to the hospital. The lieutenant was carried. In this country, an editor who can write well is valuable, but he is not likely to remain so unless he can handle a saber with charm. The following very recent telegram shows that also in France, duels are humanely stopped as soon as they approach the French danger point. Reuters telegram, Paris, March 5th. The duel between Colonels Henry and Picard took place this morning in the riding school of the École Militaire. the doors of which were strictly guarded in order to prevent intrusion. The combatants, who fought with swords, were in position at 10 o'clock. At the first re-engagement, Lieutenant Colonel Henry was slightly scratched in the forearm, and just at the same moment his own blade appeared to touch his adversary's neck. Senator Ronk, who was Colonel Picard's second, stopped the fight, but as it was found that his principal had not been touched, the combat continued. A very sharp encounter ensued, in which Colonel Henry was wounded in the elbow, and the duel terminated. After which, the stretcher and the band. In lurid contrast with this delicate filtration, we have this fatal duel of day before yesterday in Italy, where the earnest Austrian duel is in vogue. I knew Cavallotti slightly, and this gives me a sort of personal interest in his duel. I first saw him in Rome several years ago. He was sitting on a block of stone in the Forum, and was writing something in his notebook, a poem or a challenge or something like that. And the friend who pointed him out to me said, "That is Cavallotti. He has fought 30 duels. Do not disturb him." I did not disturb him. May 13th, 1907. It is a long time ago. Cavallotti, poet, orator, satirist, statesman, patriot, was a great man, and his death was deeply lamented by his countrymen. Many monuments to his memory testify to this. In his duels, he killed several of his antagonists and disabled the rest. By nature, he was a little irascible. Once, when the officials of the Library of Bologna threw out his books, the gentle poet went up there and challenged the whole 15. His parliamentary duties were exacting, but he proposed to keep coming up and fighting duels between trains until all those officials had been retired from the activities of life. Although he always chose the sword to fight with, he had never had a lesson with that weapon. When game was called, he waited for nothing, but always plunged at his opponent and rained such a storm of wild and original thrusts and whacks upon him that the man was dead or crippled before he could bring his science to bear. But his latest antagonist discarded science and won. He held his sword straight forward like a lance when Cavallotti made his plunge, with the result that he impaled himself upon it. It entered his mouth and passed out the back of his neck. Death was instantaneous. Dictated December 20th, 1906. 6 months ago was when I was recalling early days in San Francisco. I broke off at a place where I was about to tell about Captain Osborne's odd adventure at the What Cheer, or perhaps it was at another cheap feeding place, the Miners' Restaurant. It was a place where one could get good food on the cheapest possible terms, and its popularity was great among the multitudes whose purses were light. It was a good place to go to observe mixed humanity. Captain Osborne and Bret Harte went there one day and took a meal, and in the course of it, Osborne fished up an interesting reminiscence of a dozen years before and told about it. It was to this effect. He was a midshipman in the Navy when the Californian gold craze burst upon the world and set it wild with excitement. His ship made the long journey round the Horn and was approaching her goal, the Golden Gate, when an accident happened. "It happened to me," said Osborne. "I fell overboard. There was a heavy sea running, but no one was much alarmed about me, because we had on board a newly patented life-saving device, which was believed to be competent to rescue anything that could fall overboard, from a midshipman to an anchor. Ours was the only ship that had this device. We were very proud of it, and had been anxious to give its powers a practical test. This thing was lashed to the garboard strake of the main two-gallant mizzen-yard amidships, and there was nothing to do but cut the lashings and heave it over. It would do the rest. One day the cry of 'Man overboard!' brought all hands on deck. Instantly the lashings were cut and the machine flung joyously over. Damnation, it went to the bottom like an anvil. By the time that the ship was brought to and a boat manned, I was become but a bobbing speck on the waves, half a mile astern, and losing my strength very fast. But by good luck there was a common seaman on board who had practical ideas in his head and hadn't waited to see what the patent machine was going to do, but had run aft and sprung over after me the moment the alarm was cried through the ship. I had a good deal of a start on him, and the seas made his progress slow and difficult, but he stuck to his work and fought his way to me, and just in the nick of time he put his saving arms about me when I was about to go down. He held me up until the boat reached us and rescued us. By that time I was unconscious, and I was still unconscious when we arrived at the ship. A dangerous fever followed, and I was delirious for 3 days. Then I come to myself and at once inquired for my benefactor. Of course, he was gone. We were lying at anchor in the bay, and every man had deserted to the gold mines except the commissioned officers. I found out nothing about my benefactor but his name, Burton Sanders, a name which I have held in grateful memory ever since. Every time I have been on the coast, these 12 or 13 years, I have tried to get track of him, but have never succeeded. I wish I could find him and make him understand that his brave act has never been forgotten by me. Hart, I would rather see him and take him by the hand than any other man on the planet. At this stage, or a little later, there was an interruption. A waiter nearby said to another waiter, pointing, "Take a look at that tramp that's coming in. Ain't he the one that built the house last week out of 10 cents? I believe it is. Let him alone. Don't pay any attention to him. Wait till we can get a good look at him." The tramp approached timidly and hesitatingly with the air of one unsure and apprehensive. The waiters watched him furtively. When he was passing behind Hart's chair, one of them said, "He's the one," and they pounced upon him and proposed to turn him over to the police as a bilk. He begged piteously. He confessed his guilt, but said he had been driven to his crime by necessity, that when he had eaten the plate of beans and flipped out without paying for it, it was because he was starving and hadn't the 10 cents to pay for it with. But the waiters would listen to no explanations, no palliations. He must be placed in custody. He brushed his hand across his eyes and said meekly that he would submit, being friendless. Each waiter took him by an arm and faced him about to conduct him away. Then his melancholy eyes fell upon Captain Osborne, and a light of glad and eager recognition flashed from them. He said, "Weren't you a midshipman once, sir, in the old Lancaster?" "Yes," said Osborne. "Why?" "Didn't you fall overboard?" "Yes, I did. How did you come to know about it?" "Wasn't there a new patent machine aboard, and didn't they throw it over to save you?" "Why, yes," said Osborne, laughing gently, "but it didn't do it." "No, sir, it was a sailor that done it." "It certainly was. Look here, my man, you are getting distinctly interesting. Were you of our crew?" "Yes, sir, I was." "I reckon you may be right. You do certainly know a good deal about that incident. What's your name?" "Burton Sanders." The captain sprung up, excited, and said, "Give me your hand. Give me both your hands. I'd rather shake them than inherit a fortune." And then he cried to the waiters, "Let him go. Take your hands off. He is my guest, and he can have anything and everything this house is able to furnish. I am responsible." There was a love feast then. Captain Osborne ordered it regardless of expense, and he and Hart sat there and listened while the man told stirring adventures of his life and fed himself up to the eyebrows. Then Osborne wanted to be a benefactor in his turn and pay back some of his debt. The man said it could all be paid with $10, that it had been so long since he had owned that amount of money that it would seem a fortune to him, and he should be grateful beyond words if the captain could spare him that amount. The captain spared him 10 broad $20 gold pieces and made him take them in spite of his modest protestations, and gave him his address and said he must never fail to give him notice when he needed grateful service. Several months later, Hart stumbled upon the man in the street. He was most comfortably drunk and pleasant and chatty. Hart remarked upon the splendidly and movingly dramatic incident of the restaurant and said, "How curious and fortunate and happy and interesting it was that you two should come together after that long separation, and at exactly the right moment, to save you from disaster and turn your defeat by the waiters into a victory. A preacher could make a great sermon out of that, for it does look as if the hand of Providence was in it." The hero's face assumed a sweetly genial expression, and he said, "Well, now, it wasn't Providence this time. I was running the arrangements myself." "How do you mean?" "Oh, I hadn't ever seen the gentleman before. I was at the next table, with my back to you the whole time he was telling about it. I saw my chance, and slipped out and fetched the two waiters with me and offered to give them a commission out of what I could get out of the captain, if they would do a quarrel act with me and give me an opening. So then, after a minute or two, I straggled back, and you two know the rest of it as well as I do." Chapter 23. Dictated March 9th, 1906. I am talking of a time 60 years ago and upwards. I remember the names of some of those schoolmates, and by fitful glimpses, even their faces rise dimly before me for a moment, only just long enough to be recognized, then they vanish. I catch glimpses of George Robards, the Latin pupil, slender, pale, studious, bending over his book and absorbed by it. His long, straight black hair hanging down below his jaws like a pair of curtains on the side of his face. I can see him give his head a toss and flirt one of the curtains back around his head to get it out of his way, apparently, really to show off. In that day it was a great thing among the boys to have the hair of so flexible a sort that it could be flung back in that way, with a flirt of the head. George Robards was the envy of us all, for there was no hair among us that was so competent for this exhibition as his, except, perhaps, the yellow locks of Will Bowen and John Robards. My hair was a dense ruck of short curls, and so was my brother Henry's. We tried all kinds of devices to get these crooks straightened out so that they would flirt, but we never succeeded. Sometimes, by soaking our heads and then combing and brushing our hair down tight and flat to our skulls, we could get it straight, temporarily, and this gave us a comforting moment of joy. But the first time we gave it a flirt, it all shriveled into curls again, and our happiness was gone. John Robards was the little brother of George. He was a wee chap with silky golden curtains to his face which dangled to his shoulders and below and could be flung back ravishingly. When he was 12 years old, he crossed the plains with his father amidst the rush of the gold seekers of '49, and I remember the departure of the cavalcade when it spurred westward. We were all there to see and to envy, and I can still see that proud little chap sailing by on a great horse, with his long locks streaming out behind. We were all on hands agaze and envy when he returned 2 years later in unimaginable glory, for he had traveled. None of us had ever been 40 miles from home, but he had crossed the continent. He had been in the gold mines, that fairyland of our imagination, and he had done a still more wonderful thing. He had been in ships on the actual ocean, in ships on 3 actual oceans, for he had sailed down the Pacific and around the Horn among icebergs and through snowstorms and wild, wintry gales, and had sailed on and turned the corner and flown northward in the trades and up through the blistering equatorial waters. And there in his brown face were the proofs of what he had been through. We would have sold our souls to Satan for the privilege of trading places with him. I saw him when I was out on that Missouri trip 4 years ago. He was old then, though not quite so old as I, and the burden of life was upon him. He said his granddaughter, 12 years old, had read my books and would like to see me. It was a pathetic time, for she was a prisoner in her room and marked for death, and John knew that she was passing swiftly away. 12 years old, just her grandfather's age when he rode away on that great journey with his yellow hair flapping behind him. In her, I seemed to see that boy again. It was as if he had come back out of that remote past and was present before me in his golden youth. Her malady was heart disease, and her brief life came to a close a few days later. Another of those schoolboys was John Garth. He became a prosperous banker and a prominent and valued citizen, and a few years ago he died, rich and honored. He died. It is what I have to say about so many of those boys and girls. The widow still lives, and there are grandchildren. In her pantalette days and my barefoot days, she was a schoolmate of mine. I saw John's tomb when I made that Missouri visit. Her father, Mr. Kercheval, had an apprentice in the early days when I was 9 years old, and he also had a slave woman who had many merits. But I can't feel very kindly or forgivingly toward either that good apprentice boy or that good slave woman, for they saved my life. One day when I was playing on a loose log which was supposed to attach to a raft, but it wasn't. It tilted me into Bear Creek, and when I had been underwater twice and was coming up to make the third and fatal descent, my fingers appeared above the water, and that slave woman seized them and pulled me out. Within a week I was in again, and that apprentice had come along just at the wrong time, and he plunged in and dived, pawed around on the bottom, and found me, and dragged me out and emptied the water out of me, and I was saved again. I was drowned 7 times after that before I learned to swim, once in Bear Creek and 6 times in the Mississippi. I do not now know who the people were who interfered with the intentions of a providence wiser than themselves, but I hold a grudge against them yet. When I told the tale of these remarkable happenings to Reverend Dr. Burton of Hartford, he said he did not believe it. He slipped on the ice the very next year and sprained his ankle. Will Bowen was another schoolmate, and so was his brother Sam, who was his junior by a couple years. Before the Civil War broke out, both became St. Louis and New Orleans pilots. Both are dead long ago. Dictated March 16th, 1906. We will return to those school children of 60 years ago. I recall Mary Miller. She was not my first sweetheart, but I think she was the first one that furnished me a broken heart. I fell in love with her when she was 18 and I was 9, but she scorned me, and I recognized that this was a cold world. I had not noticed that temperature before. I believe I was as miserable as even a grown man could be, but I think that this sorrow did not remain with me long. As I remember it, I soon transferred my worship to Artemisa Briggs, who was a year older than Mary Miller. When I revealed my passion to her, she did not scoff at it. She did not make fun of it. She was very kind and gentle about it, but she was also firm, and said she did not want to be pestered by children. And there was Mary Lacey. She was a schoolmate, but she was also out of my class because of her advanced age. She was pretty wild and determined and independent, but she married and at once settled down and became in all ways a model matron, and was as highly respected as any matron in the town. 4 years ago she was still living, and had been married 50 years. Jimmy McDaniel was another schoolmate. His age and mine about tallied. His father kept the candy shop, and he was the most envied little chap in the town, after Tom Blankenship, Huck Finn. For although we never saw him eating candy, we supposed that it was, nevertheless, his ordinary diet. He pretended that he never ate it, and didn't care for it because there was nothing forbidden about it. There was plenty of it, and he could have as much of it as he wanted. He was the first human being to whom I ever told a humorous story, so far as I can remember. This was about Jim Wolfe and the cats, and I gave him that tale the morning after that memorable episode. I thought he would laugh his teeth out. I had never been so proud and happy before, and have seldom been so proud and happy since. I saw him 4 years ago when I was out there. He wore a beard, gray and venerable, that came halfway down to his knees, and yet it was not difficult for me to recognize him. He had been married 54 years. He had many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, also even posterity. They all said thousands, yet the boy to whom I had told the cat story when we were callow juveniles was still present in that cheerful little old man. Artemisia Briggs got married not long after refusing me. She married Richmond the stonemason, who was my Methodist Sunday school teacher in the earliest days, and he had one distinction which I envied him. At some time or other he had hit his thumb with his hammer, and the result was a thumbnail which remained permanently twisted and distorted and curved and pointed, like a parrot's beak. I should not consider it an ornament now, I suppose, but it had a fascination for me then, and a vast value, because it was the only one in the town. He was a very kindly and considerate Sunday school teacher, and patient and compassionate, so he was the favorite teacher with us little chaps. In that school they had slender oblong pasteboard blue tickets, each with a verse from the Testament printed on it, and you could get a blue ticket by reciting 2 verses. By reciting 5 verses you could get 3 blue tickets, and you could trade these tickets at the bookcase and borrow a book for a week. I was under Mr. Richmond's spiritual care every now and then for 2 or 3 years, and he was never hard upon me. I always recited the same 5 verses every Sunday. He was always satisfied with the performance. He never seemed to notice that these were the same 5 foolish virgins that he had been hearing about every Sunday for months. I always got my tickets and exchanged them for a book. They were pretty dreary books, for there was not a bad boy in the entire bookcase. They were all good boys and good girls, and drearily uninteresting, but they were better society than none, and I was glad to have their company and disapprove of it. 20 years ago, Mr. Richmond had become possessed of Tom Sawyer's Cave in the hills 3 miles from town, and had made a tourist resort of it. In 1849, when the gold seekers were streaming through our little town of Hannibal, many of our grown men got the gold fever, and I think that all the boys had it. On the Saturday holidays in the summertime, we used to borrow skiffs whose owners were not present, and go down the river 3 miles to the cave hollow, Missourian for valley, and there we staked out claims and pretended to dig gold, panning out half a dollar a day at first, 2 or 3 times as much later, and by whole fortunes as our imaginations became inured to the work. Stupid and unprophetic lads, we were doing this in play and never suspecting. Why, that cave hollow and all the adjacent hills were made of gold, but we did not know it. We took it for dirt. We left its rich secret in its own peaceful possession, and grew up in poverty and went wandering about the world, struggling for bread. And this because we had not the gift of prophecy. That region was all dirt and rocks to us, yet all it needed was to be ground up and scientifically handled, and it was gold. That is to say, the whole region was a cement mine, and they make the finest kind of Portland cement there now, 5,000 barrels a day, with a plant that cost $2 million. For a little while, Reuel Gridley attended that school of ours. He was an elderly pupil. He was perhaps 22 or 23 years old. Then came the Mexican War, and he volunteered. A company of infantry was raised in our town, and Mr. Hickman, a tall, straight, handsome athlete of 25, was made captain of it and had a sword by his side and a broad yellow stripe down the leg of his gray pants. And when that company marched back and forth through the streets in its smart uniform, which it did several times a day for drill, its evolutions were attended by all the boys whenever the school hours permitted. I can see that marching company yet, and I can almost feel again the consuming desire that I had to join it. But they had no use for boys of 12 and 13, and before I had a chance in another war, the desire to kill people to whom I had not been introduced had passed away. I saw the splendid Hickman in his old age. He seemed about the oldest man I had ever seen, an amazing and melancholy contrast with the showy young captain I had seen preparing his warriors for carnage so many, many years before. Hickman is dead. It is the old story. As Susie said, "What is it all for?" Reuel Gridley went away to the wars, and we heard of him no more for 15 or 16 years. Then one day in Carson City, while I was having a difficulty with an editor on the sidewalk, an editor better built for war than I was, I heard a voice say, "Give him the best you've got, Sam. I'm at your back." It was Reuel Gridley. He said he had not recognized me by my face, but by my drawling style of speech. He went down to the Reese River mines about that time, and presently he lost an election bet in his mining camp, and by the terms of it he was obliged to buy a 50-pound sack of self-raising flour and carry it through the town, preceded by music, and deliver it to the winner of the bet. Of course, the whole camp was present and full of fluid and enthusiasm. The winner of the bet put up the sack at auction for the benefit of the United States Sanitary Fund and sold it. The excitement grew and grew. The sack was sold over and over again for the benefit of the fund. The news of it came to Virginia City by telegraph. It produced great enthusiasm, and Reuel Gridley was begged by telegraph to bring the sack and have an auction in Virginia City. He bought it. An open baroque was provided, also a brass band. The sack was sold over and over again at Gold Hill, then was brought up to Virginia City toward night and sold again and again, and still again, netting $20,000 or $30,000 for the sanitary fund. Gridley carried it across California and sold it at various towns. He sold it for large sums in Sacramento and San Francisco. He brought it east and sold it in New York and in various other cities, then carried it out to a great fair at St. Louis and went on selling it, and finally made it up into small cakes and sold those at $1 apiece. First and last, the sack of flour, which had originally cost $10, perhaps netted more than $200,000 for the sanitary fund. Reuel Gridley has been dead these many, many years. It is the old story. In that school were the first Jews I had ever seen. It took me a good while to get over the awe of it. To my fancy, they were clothed invisibly in the damp and cobwebby mold of antiquity. They carried me back to Egypt, and in imagination I moved among the pharaohs and all the shadowy celebrities of that remote age. The name of the boys was Levin. We had a collective name for them, which was the only really large and handsome witticism that was ever born in that congressional district. We called them 22, and even when the joke was old and had been worn threadbare, we always followed it with the explanation to make sure that it would be understood. Twice Levin, 22. There were other boys whose names remain with me. Irving Ayers, but no matter, he is dead. Then there was George Butler, whom I remember as a child of 7 wearing a blue leather belt with a brass buckle, and hated and envied by all the boys on account of it. He was a nephew of General Ben Butler and fought gallantly at Ball's Bluff and in several other actions of the Civil War. He is dead long and long ago. Will Bowen, dead long ago. Ed Stevens, dead long ago. And John Briggs were special mates of mine. John is still living. 1845. In 1845, I was 10 years old. There was an epidemic of the measles in the town, and it made a most alarming slaughter among the little people. There was a funeral almost daily, and the mothers of the town were nearly demented with fright. My mother was greatly troubled. She worried over Pamela and Henry and me, and took constant and extraordinary pains to keep us from coming into contact with the contagion. But upon reflection, I believe that her judgment was at fault. It seemed to me that I could improve upon it if left to my own devices. I cannot remember now whether I was frightened about the measles or not, but I clearly remember that I grew very tired of the suspense I suffered on account of being continually under the threat of death. I remember that I got so weary of it and so anxious to have the matter settled one way or the other, and promptly, that this anxiety spoiled my days and my nights. I had no pleasure in them. I made up my mind to end this surprise and be done with it. Will Bowen was dangerously ill with the measles, and I thought I would go down there and catch them. I entered the house by the front way and slipped along through the rooms and halls, keeping sharp watch against discovery, and at last I reached Will's bedchamber in the rear of the house on the second floor and got into it uncaptured. But that was as far as my victory reached. His mother caught me there a moment later and snatched me out of the house and gave me a most competent scolding and drove me away. She was so scared that she could hardly get her words out, and her face was white. I saw that I must manage better next time, and I did. I hung about the lane at the rear of the house and watched through cracks in the fence until I was convinced that the conditions were favorable. Then I slipped through the backyard and up the back way, and got into the room and into the bed with Will Bowen without being observed. I don't know how long I was in the bed. I only remember that Will Bowen, as society, had no value for me. He was too sick to even notice that I was there. When I heard his mother coming, I covered up my head, but that device was a failure. It was dead summertime. The cover was nothing more than a limp Blake in her sheet, and anybody could see that there were two of us under it. It didn't remain too very long. Mrs. Bowen snatched me out of the bed and conducted me home herself, with a grip on my collar which she never loosened until she delivered me into my mother's hands, along with her opinion of that kind of a boy. It was a good case of the measles that resulted. It brought me within a shade of death's door. It brought me to where I could no longer took any interest in anything, but, on the contrary, felt a total absence of interest, which was most placid and enchanting. I have never enjoyed anything in my life more than I enjoyed dying that time. I was, in effect, dying. The word had been passed and the family notified to assemble around the bed and see me off. I knew them all. There was no doubtfulness in my vision. They were all crying, but that did not affect me. I took but the vaguest interest in it, and that merely because I was the center of all this emotional attention and was gratified by it and vain of it. When Dr. Cunningham had made up his mind that nothing more could be done for me, he put bags of hot ashes all over me. He put them on my breast, on my wrists, on my ankles, and so, very much to his astonishment, and doubtless to my regret, he dragged me back into this world and set me going again. Dictated July 26th. 1907, in an article entitled England's Ovation to Mark Twain, Sidney Brooks, but never mind that now. I was in Oxford by 7 o'clock that evening, June 25th, 1907, and trying on a scarlet gown which the tailor had been constructing, and found it right and surpassingly becoming. At 10:30 the next morning we assembled at All Souls College and marched thence, gowned, mortarboarded, and in double file down a long street to the Sheldonian Theatre, between solid walls of the populace, very much hurrahed and limitlessly kodaked. We made a procession of considerable length and distinction and picturesqueness, with the Chancellor, Lord Curzon, late Viceroy of India, in his rich robe of black and gold, in the lead, followed by a pair of trim little boy train bearers, and the train bearers followed by the young Prince Arthur of Connaught, who was made a DCL. The detachment of DCLs were followed by the doctors of science, and these by the doctors of literature, and these in turn by the doctors of music. Sidney Colvin marched in front of me. I was coupled with Sidney Lee, and Kipling followed us. General Booth of the Salvation Army was in the squadron of DCLs. Our journey ended, and we were halted in a fine old hall whence we could see, through a corridor of some length, the massed audience in the theater. Here, for a little time, we moved about and chatted and made acquaintanceships. Then the DCLs were summoned, and they marched through that corridor, and the shouting began in the theater. It would be some time before the doctors of literature and of science would be called for, because each of those DCLs had to have a couple of Latin speeches made over him before his promotion would be complete, one by the Regius Professor of Civil Law, the other by the Chancellor. After a while, I asked Sir William Ramsay if a person might smoke here and not get shot. He said, yes, but that whoever did it and got caught would be fined a guinea, and perhaps hanged later. He said he knew of a place where we could accomplish at least as much as half of a smoke before any informers would be likely to chance upon us, and he was ready to show the way to any who might be willing to risk the guinea and the hanging. By request, he led the way, and Kipling, Sir Norman Lockyer, and I followed. We crossed an unpopulated quadrangle and stood under one of its exits, an archway of massive masonry. And there we lit up and began to take comfort. The photographers soon arrived, but they were courteous and friendly and gave us no trouble, and we gave them none. They grouped us in all sorts of ways and photographed us at their diligent leisure while we smoked and talked. We were there more than an hour. Then we returned to headquarters, happy, content, and greatly refreshed. Presently we filed into the theater under a very satisfactory hurrah, and waited in a crimson column, dividing the crowded pit through the middle, until each of us in his turn should be called to stand before the Chancellor and hear our merits set forth in sonorous Latin. Meantime, Kipling and I wrote autographs until some good, kind soul interfered in our behalf and procured for us a rest. I will now save what is left of my modesty by quoting a paragraph from Sidney Brooks's Ovation. Let those stars take the place of it for the present. Sidney Brooks has done it well. It makes me proud to read it, as proud as I was in that old day 62 years ago when I lay dying, the center of attraction, with one eye piously closed upon the fleeting vanities of this life, an excellent effect, and the other open a crack to observe the tears, the sorrow, the admiration, all for me, all for me. Ah, that was the proudest moment of my long life, until Oxford. Most Americans have been to Oxford and will remember what a dream of the Middle Ages it is, with its crooked lanes, its gray and stately piles of ancient architecture, and its meditation-breeding air of repose and dignity and unkinship with the noise and fret and hurry of these modern days. As a dream of the Middle Ages, Oxford was not present until pageant day arrived and furnished certain details which had been for generations lacking. These details began to appear at mid-afternoon on the 27th. At that time, singles, couples, groups, and squadrons of the 3,500 costumed characters who were to take part in the pageant began to ooze and drip and stream through house doors all over Old Town, and wend toward the meadows outside the walls. Soon the lanes were thronged with costumes which Oxford had from time to time seen and been familiar with in bygone centuries, fashions of dress which marked off centuries as by dates, and milestoned them back and back and back until history faded into legend and tradition, when Arthur was a fact and the Round Table a reality. In this rich commingling of quaint and strange and brilliantly covered fashions in dress and dress changes of Oxford for 12 centuries, stood livid, and realized to the eye Oxford as a dream of the Middle Ages was complete now as it had never in our day been before complete. At last there was no discord. The moldering old buildings and the picturesque throngs drifting past them were in harmony. Soon, astonishingly soon, the only persons that seemed out of place and grotesquely and offensively and criminally out of place were such persons as came intruding along, clothed in the ugly and odious fashions of the 20th century. They were a bitterness to the feelings, an insult to the eye. The make-ups of illustrious historic personages seemed perfect, both as to portraiture and costume. One had no trouble in recognizing them. Also, I was apparently quite easily recognizable myself. The first corner I turned brought me suddenly face to face with Henry VIII, a person who I had been implacably disliking for 60 years. But when he put out his hand and with royal courtliness and grace and said, "Welcome, beloved stranger, to my century and to the hospitalities of my realm," my old prejudices vanished away and I forgave him. I think now that Henry VIII has been over-abused and that most of us, if we had been situated as he was, domestically, would not have been able to get along with as limited a graveyard as he forced himself to put up with. I feel now that he was one of the nicest men in history. Personal contact with the king is more effective in removing baleful prejudices than is any amount of argument drawn from tales and histories. If I had a child, I would name it Henry VIII, regardless of sex. Do you remember Charles I and his broad slouch with the plume in it, and his slender, tall figure, and his body clothed in velvet doublet with lace sleeves, and his legs in leather, with long rapier at his side and his spurs on his heels? I encountered him at the next corner and knew him in a moment. Knew him as perfectly and as vividly as I should know the Grand Chain in the Mississippi if I should see it from the pilot house after all these years. He bent his body and gave his hat a sweep that fetched its plume within an inch of the ground, and gave me a welcome that went to my heart. This king has been much maligned. I shall understand him better hereafter, and shall regret him more than I have been in the habit of doing these 50 or 60 years. He did some things in his time which might better have been left undone, and which cast a shadow upon his name. We all know that. We all concede it. But our error has been in regarding them as crimes, and in calling them by that name, whereas I perceive now that they were only indiscretions. At every few steps I met persons of deathless name who I had never encountered before outside of pictures and statuary and history, and these were most thrilling and charming encounters. I had handshakes with Henry II, who had not been seen in the Oxford streets for nearly 800 years, and with the fair Rosamond, whom I now believe to have been chaste and blameless, although I had thought differently about it before, and with Shakespeare, one of the pleasantest foreigners I've ever gotten acquainted with, and with Roger Bacon, and with Queen Elizabeth, who talked 5 minutes and never swore once. A fact which gave me a new and good opinion of her and moved me to forgive her for beheading the Scottish Mary, if she really did it, which I now doubt, and with the quaintly and accidentally and anciently clad young King Harold Harefoot of near 900 years ago, who came flying by on a bicycle and smoking a pipe, but at once checked up and got off to shake with me. And also I met a bishop who had lost his way because this was the first time he had been inside the walls of Oxford for as much as 1200 years or thereabouts. By this time I had grown so used to the obliterated ages and their best-known people that if I had met Adam I should not have been either surprised or embarrassed. And if he had come in a racing automobile with a cloud of dust, with nothing on but his fig leaf, it would have seemed to me all right and harmonious.